A part of the market thinks that the only answer is universal primary data for every use case. And there's a different slice of the market, which is much smaller, that thinks actually universal secondary data is sufficient. You can have satellite imagery, you can enrich that, and you can actually get great modeling. Secondary data is probably good enough for the majority of environmental reporting use cases. But where you want to actually invest in change, where you have a business case and a project that you want to implement, there you need primary data to demonstrate why the money is well spent. This is the State of Sustainability podcast brought to you by Altruistic. Today we're joined by Pedro Lafargue, a Global Climate Action Manager at Olam Food Ingredients, OFI, to discuss the do's and don'ts on setting up reduction initiatives within the organization's value chain. Olam is a super exciting organization, OFI as well. There's a really interesting backstory to the brand. It has its origins, I believe, in the edible oil trade in Nigeria and has grown into a vast global business since then. If you have bought food products at a grocery store, if you've walked into a fast food outlet or a coffee chain or a coffee shop, you have almost certainly bought products that have been touched in some shape or form by the Olam brand and by OFI in particular. So super excited to have Pedro join us today to talk a little bit more about OFI and the Olam story. Pedro is a seasoned expert on the reduction and insetting topic, having set up, implemented, and scaled reduction initiatives across OFI's supply chain, including cocoa, coffee, dairy, nuts, and spices. I'm super excited to have Pedro with us today. Pedro and I actually met at an event, Pedro, right, in Berlin a couple of months ago, I think. And from the feedback my team gave me, I wasn't able to see Pedro's actual talk, but from the feedback my team gave me, I felt a combination of both FOMO and envy. FOMO because I was sorry to have missed it, and envy because I understand that Pedro's talk probably outshone mine, which made me feel, of course, incredibly jealous. But we thought that the next best thing is to bring the two of us together and just have a conversation, get to know each other a bit better, and also, of course, bring some of the fantastic experience from Pedro's work into the altruistic community. So super excited to have you with us, Pedro.
Thank you, Saif. That's a great introduction. And again, lovely to be in this podcast together and discuss about the reality of the two worlds that you and me have experimented, both as coming from a farming background and also from a strategic background. So it's really good to be in the same page and show the experience that we have. So from my side, just to explain a little bit on the OFI, which is now since 2 years ago in Olam. As you well mentioned, Olam Group, as it is today, used to have a combination of multiple portfolios. So cotton, wheat, soy, palm, rubber, and the rest of products that you mentioned. So we split the company 2 years ago. And of course, each of these is a reason, but it doesn't mean that we don't apply the same principles, right, for each of the products or projects. And as you refer very well, on insetting projects and carbon reduction projects, we both need to follow the same structures, but of course at different levels. So when I joined the company, we were one group. So I've worked with the cotton business unit. We've worked on traceability for all the spices team, for the palm projects, for the rubber projects. But as you rightly mentioned, today I focus mostly on our cocoa supply chains, which are across more than 20 countries. Coffee, again, we have products in South America, Central America, Africa, Asia, and all our supply chains need to have the same attention. So it makes this role very exciting and very on the ground, which is a great way to connect to the corporate account and making things happen in the right way.
I can imagine, Pedro. And from what I actually read a case study many years ago on Olam. I think it was a Harvard Business Review case study or something. This is like a decade or so ago. I'd love to understand a little more, Pedro, about the split between Olam and OFI and kind of how that works. But also the reason I bring up the case study is because what I understand Olam originally, and I imagine this is true for OFI as well, what the core capability was that you guys were able and ready to go right to the farm gate. And so when we're talking about nuts and cocoa and coffee, my understanding is that OFI traders literally go all the way down to the farm. You go to many geographies which are hard to reach, hard to access, hard to build relationships. Cocoa is a great example, but coffee is a great example. You build relationships there with the farmers, but then you also go all the way in the other direction, where you also have outposts, commercial outposts in every major city of the world, and therefore you're able to build commercial relationships with all the big food brands and big food processors as well. And so you're able to kind of provide an end-to-end supply chain solution for the ingredients and materials that you provide. Have I gotten it right, Pedro?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So one of the biggest USP as OFI is the connection with the farmer. So as you said, we try to work, I wouldn't say a complete vertical integrated supply chain, but direct to the farmer or direct to the jurisdictional buying agent, for example. And that allows us not only to have good traceability, but it also allows us to have better data quality. It allows us to reduce the challenges or risk mitigation because you're working directly with the farmer or with the farmer group. And by having this direct connection with the farmer group, we can work with our customers and we can build projects that can have an impact on that farmer group. So let's imagine a farmer group can have 500 or 1,000 farmers within the farmer group. This means that our teams that we have set up around the world can go give training to the farmers in good agricultural practices. Now we're giving trainings in regenerative agriculture and carbon reductions. But of course, we need to understand the context of how do we say regen ag or how do we say carbon mitigation to a farmer that is focused more in the yield and the productivity and basically just having a living income for them. So that's the USP of OFI is from the beginning and the inception of Olam, when our founders were, as you said, in Nigeria collecting, I think it was cashew and other products. That relationship, that trust that happened with the farmer is what started building a natural growth of the company. And one of the things that I presented through in the Berlin conference when we were together was that we have one of our most important tools. It's called Olam Farmer Information System. And in parallel, this platform, which is a whole software, allows us also to send messages back to the farmer with, for example, in coffee, with the price, the market price of how the price is going on that day, the change in the particular hours. And the farmer has the control to decide if he wants to sell to us or to sell to someone else, right? So that it gives us this transparency and it gives us this also trust with the farmer that probably the market is really high, but that is not going to cover, for example, the training or the incentives or delivering new trees or fertilizers. So it's a challenge and a blessing, I would say, having the direct relationship being so transparent. But I think that's the way to go. I don't think that for carbon purposes or for any of the compliance that we need to follow, there is another way. We need to work directly with the community.
I agree, Pedro. I actually spent a year as a potato trader many years ago. And this is in Pakistan, where I grew up. And in the potato industry, and I'm sure you see this repeated across many different products, in the potato industry, the price volatility is super high over the course of the year. And in the market that I was operating in, you could get an 80% spike in prices, let's say 7 or 8 months later. And it was super cyclical, where if you have a great year for potato prices, every farmer starts growing potatoes. And then the next year you get a massive tank in the prices because there's a glut or an oversupply of potatoes. So I find the pricing analytics side of this topic super interesting. But to bring us back to sustainability, could you tell us a little bit more about where the pressure comes from? Because what I notice, we speak with most of the large trading houses across many different materials. And my observation now for the last few years is that OFI seems to me, outside in, to be one of the most forward-leaning in terms of how you guys think about data and how you guys think about driving change into the supply chain. And so I'd love to understand where that comes from. Is it customer driven? Is it regulation? Is it the owners? Is it all of these? Could you tell us a little bit more about why this topic is important for you?
Of course. So I think, of course, I cannot take all the benefits of what's happening in the changes in OFI, in oil and food ingredients. And this started with our CEO or founder many years ago. I think we're talking about 5 to 6 years ago. The main tool that was developed at the time, thinking about sustainability, not just about agriculture, but sustainability, was AdSource. And AdSource basically is our platform that allows to monitor and track farmer group performance. And this came from Sonny, our founder, and Shekhar. And it was a visionary decision to say, at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, having a carbon footprint, having a climate performance, having a human rights performance, it's going to be a requirement. And again, we're talking about 7 to 8 years ago. And then that product launched, right? And it launched like a mock-up. And then we started looking at the traction. Now, on the same side, you start the development, or you start seeing the development of regulations. You start seeing what we have this year: EUDR, CSRD, double materialities, SBTI, AFI, etc. And you look at that by being accountable for your environmental transition, basically, you're also a more attractive company for green loans, for different investments. This also is allowing the company to work closer to the customers. In our case, chocolate manufacturers, coffee roasters, companies that are producing spices or mixed products, etc. Each of these companies has its own roadmap, right? So what we try to do is to follow what Sonny and Tim thought 8 years ago, and then try to give it to our customers in a way that can be packaged, not just as a report, but as a whole project and a program that is linked to them. So going to your point, who is driving this? I would say currently it's driven by regulations and customers that want to show an impact. Of course, there are challenges between connecting the two worlds about corporate accounting, JG protocol corporate accounting, and a market-based approach, right? And also aligning to the project accounting. So we're talking about 3 different things that we need to bundle together to make it attractive for customers. But I think that's the main driver. It's also the need for countries where we're sourcing from to demonstrate that companies are doing the right things with the farmers. As you know, most of the products that we source or where we operate have country challenges, government and geopolitical challenges. So by following those regulations, we're also trying to comply with what the country needs. And especially if we think about NDCs or carbon removals, which is the majority of projects, right?
Pedro, I'm going to jump in there because I already have a bunch of things I want to ask you off the back of what you've said. Let me maybe start off with the landscape of solutions in this space. And I know I speak for almost every sustainability professional in a big company when I say that it is hard to understand all of the different players and what they do and how all these things interplay. And so if I think about, let's say, at Source and Altruistic, just as 2 examples, we work with some of OFI's largest customers. And so our main sector is, we do a lot of work in food and beverage, we do some work in personal care, we do some work in apparel. And we typically cover, let's say, the carbon accounting or the environmental accounting, because we're increasingly doing water and waste and other metrics as well. We do the product environmental footprints at the level of the stock keeping unit, and we're increasingly doing or running the supply chain engagement program as well. At Source has huge elements of complementarity, to my understanding, with what we do, because there's a data landscape that we would not cover in terms of going all the way to primary data for a range of global smallholder farmers, for instance, that might be in your network. But I'd love to understand in your words, like what are the different categories of solutions that you're seeing out there? How do you see a tool like AdSource coming into play there? Do you think that there's an interoperability story here? Or do you think the market gravitates to one solution or two? I'd love to just get your perspectives, if you think from the lens of your customers, the perspective on the market.
I think, that's a great point. We've done many assessments with customers and also with companies like Altruistic in trying to understand, is it primary data always required to be compliant, right? And that's the first question. When we discuss this with WBCSD, we discuss it with consultants or with the SBTI task force, we need to understand, is it really needed, compulsory, to be at the farm gate? And that makes a big difference. So if we talk just about carbon reporting based on a supply chain and we talk about you need to be compliant, probably primary data is not the most relevant. However, on our side, because we invest so much with our customers into projects, primary data is crucial. Now, that doesn't mean that primary data for every single parameter that you need to use for a life cycle assessment or for a traceability issue needs to be always primary data, right? It means that, as you said, it's probably a modular way. It's probably a modular approach. I've discussed with many companies about just partnering, combining, because it doesn't add to the solution having 10, 20 tools to give you one baseline for a project, right? If things could be modular and just connecting footprint tools plus traceability tools plus other tools that can do your transport or your monitoring of volumes, etc., then that would be, I think, a success. There is many tools that want to give everything in one package. I think from a corporate perspective, I'm not talking just from a company perspective, but from a corporate perspective, having one single tool as an offer to a corporate makes it very challenging to adopt. Because we have, as you rightly said, we have 50 countries that we work with. We are in every continent. There is different tools, different systems. And we as a corporate cannot tell to each origin, you need to follow this system, this tool, this software, because there are many other constraints. So that's why I'm making a point on the modular side. I think that would be crucial.
I agree. I also think, Pedro, you make a really good point around primary and secondary data. In that I think I find two biases in the market, and we talked about this a little in Berlin. I think that a part of the market thinks that the only answer is universal primary data for every use case, for every supplier, for every purchase. And there's a different slice of the market, which is much smaller, that thinks actually universal secondary data is sufficient. You can have satellite imagery, you can enrich that, and you can actually get great modeling. Whereas my thinking is actually quite similar, I think, to yours, which is that it depends on what you want to do with the data. Sure. And so actually secondary data is probably good enough for the majority of environmental reporting use cases and the majority of coverage, let's say, in individual purchases, individual suppliers. But where you want to actually invest in change, where you have a business case and a project that you want to implement, or where you want to reward a certain supplier that actually claims that they're over and above the average, there you need primary data to demonstrate why the money is well spent. That's my view. Do you think I'm getting it right? Is there anything you add or change?
I think that's correct. So I'll give you an example. We work with multiple methodologies for tracking carbon removals or for tracking soil improvements, even for fertilizer management and etc. So what we need as a baseline, for example, just to scope the locations, there's always needs to be a first stage, which is feasibility, right? Pre-feasibility and scoping. And for that, you don't need really the primary data at the beginning. You need to understand where to go, and not just where to go as a procurement team or a sustainability team, but think about the next 10 years in your company. Are you going to go and harvest in Nigeria based on the geopolitical situation? Yes or no? What are the risks, right? So For that, probably you need to have secondary data. Now, if you want to set up the project and you have a good secondary data, you can start that. You can start using that data, to move forward. And when you select your areas, your jurisdictions, that's the moment when you start with a clear plan about how much primary data you need to require and at what level, right? So doing segmentation, doing different segregation of farmers, depending on ages, depending on ethnicity, depending on culture, adaptation, etc. And to do that, you need to go and get primary data. That doesn't mean that you're going to have to go to every single farmer. You need to have a good statistical approach to reach out to the farmers and then set up a proper baseline with primary data. Now, going to your point about, is it really required to have the primary data to track the change? In the first stages, in the first years, and this is how we're doing it right now, following some methodologies, approved methodologies for tracking. The first stages, yes, primary data is crucial, right? Then that primary data, if we think about satellite imaging for tree growth, we take that satellite data for a baseline, and we take that as a part of the equation to calculate, for example, carbon stock growth. For one of the systems that we have built, which is with machine learning and which is with above ground monitoring based on satellite imaging, we take our primary data from the first years and then recalculate what the satellite is giving us. That means that you can combine primary and secondary data to have a real or more statistical proven result for that cluster, for example. So you can do that with primary data and secondary data. If you would only have secondary data, which is what most of the tech companies are showing right now, you just have an average data set that you might not be able to track further. And I think that's the advantage of combining.
I agree. And also it means that everyone producing a chocolate bar looks the same, basically, based on whatever the mass of that product is. I think that's a really fair summary. And personally, I also believe that the big opportunity here is to keep enriching the secondary data with better primary data as well, and making it better and broader. Pedro, we used a 5-letter word somewhere in this conversation, inset. And insetting, I think, as a term has already become incredibly overused, even as it is incredibly underdeveloped. And what I mean by that is I see insetting referenced now in many places, but actually I find very few organizations that can credibly describe how they would apply this, other than that it's basically an offset in the value chain. And I think that's not the fault of the organizations. I think there generally isn't very much structure around how insets are conceived, accounted for, attributed. I would love to get your take on how you are deploying insetting as a tool. And the topics that I'm most interested are almost like the boring ones, which is, what does an inset look like on paper? And how does it get reflected in the carbon accounts? And all of these sorts of topics. I'd love to get your take on it and maybe have some follow-up questions.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing to note is that we as OFI, we don't believe that we're ready to report our insetting projects that have been set up for the last 4 years, which is a shame. The main thing is because the GHG protocol has become very strict in the suggestions that were done last year on permanence, on risk. And I'm not saying that is incorrect. It's the right way to do it. But when you look at from the perspective on the ground, it's very difficult to keep the same farmer reporting to you the same number of trees. And it's very expensive also to apply the same carbon credit mechanisms to every single plot where we have a project. So going back to the cocoa example, in cocoa we have, since 2017, a project where we implement, or we plant, basically we deliver and plant trees per hectare, right? That, based on the GHG protocol, should already allow us to claim an insetting project within the farm because it's within the farm boundaries, etc. What the GHG protocol caused last year was that all the projects we had in the surroundings of the farms in the communities didn't apply into our carbon removal. So that created, of course, an internal conflict, and the farmers were already expecting to have some benefits from it. So it kind of like destabilized the way how we're implementing the projects, not just because of us, but because most of our customers wanted also to claim the benefits of what has been already done for 7 years. So we are in that stage. We as OFI right now, we are not ready to report. We have the satellite systems, we have the primary data, but we have decided to first redo a completely check of the locations of where we have planted trees, where we have delivered, and do this baseline to claim carbon removals. Now, most of these projects are, of course, in the cocoa area, are coming from the Cocoa Forest Initiative that we're part of, and based on these, all companies that source cocoa will have to do it. Now, we have another set of companies that are not part of the Cocoa Forest Initiative, but also want to have project carbon removals. So that's where more the discussion about the insettings comes in place. How do we do it? How do we set up the baseline? How do we move forward? Do we have enough hectares to start a project? How many hectares are the minimum required to have an insetting project? So all of these things come into play. And I think this is why it's important to collaborate directly with the customers, to collaborate directly with the governments, because you don't want to set up an insetting project and then look that the government has changed their NDC policy and the company is not able to claim removals because they have created credits. So it's a whole universe of decisions to make there.
And a really fascinating one, Pedro. I think that my assumption is that from a monetization perspective, there are two ways to go about this in terms of making sure that the costs are covered of the great work that you're describing. One of these I would see as being project-based, where you try and get co-investment into a project from a customer. And the other one that I'm seeing is the idea of actually baking in the price of the project into the cost of the material that you're selling to the customer, and you sort of depreciate, let's say, the cost of the project over a certain period or lifetime. Which of these two approaches, if any, do you actually see being more relevant for you? What do you think of as the trade-offs? Are you experimenting with both? I'd love to get a flavor of how you're getting investment into this.
No, so that's a again great question. So what we have and what I'm testing currently with my team is following the value change initiative, that every project, of course, needs to be linked to the volume that is sourced and sold. And I think the VCI has allowed us to look at this opportunity, creating an impact and selling that impact as an insetting project. So if you look at the value change initiative, which basically combines the project protocol and the GHG protocol, I think that's the great combination of protocol basically to set up and make claims. And the reason why I'm saying this is because in the value change initiative system, we're currently working with some of the SustainCert consultants on setting up the process for OFI. And the idea of having a supply chain where we know exactly where the product's coming from, where the volume is coming from, that will allow us to add an additional price to the product. Or as you said, take a higher risk on the project, have a cheaper project, but add that cost to the product that we can sell to a customer if it's interested in buying a low carbon product. Because we need to think about, some companies would like, of course, to buy a low carbon product as part of a tender. But in order to have a low carbon product as part of a tender, you need to have a project to have a low carbon. It's not just about cherry picking around the globe. It's about setting up the right principles from the beginning with the farmer, with the cooperative, and then being able to add this price tag to the product. But you need to demonstrate permanence, you need to demonstrate additionality, and so on. And just to finish on that idea, your first point was, can you add a price on the product, on the first product, right? Now, the second option, as you mentioned, is, sorry, can we go back to your first point was?
I was talking about the project-based approach versus baking in the price into the finished product and amortizing the project over the period of time.
Yeah, correct. So based on the adding a cost or adding a price to the impact of the reduction is the way how we are basically assessing the project to see how expensive is the project, to see what is the net investment value of that project based on a carbon reduction and a ton per ton. And with SustainCert, what we're trying to do is to get that all the projects that we have are verifiable. And by doing that, we could add that price tag per ton of reduction to the product. Now, on the other side, the majority of the projects that we have are based on a project or a GHG project investment. So it doesn't really attach to the price of the commodity that's being sold, but the investment is happening at a project level, right? So the company, the customer, and us co-invest as partners in a GHG project to mitigate emissions and also to implement regen activities. And that basically model for costing the project is all together as a partner. So the benefit of adding the price tag as an impact, as you said at the beginning, that's super interesting for customers that don't want to get to the level of the risk of the primary data, having teams on the ground, etc. Because when you get the price tag on reduction, the customer potentially has lower risk as being a partner on implementing the GHG project. And therefore, you can optimize cost on that way.
Super insightful, Pedro. I'm going to ask a slightly provocative question. And so
Sure.
Please feel free to call me out if you'd rather not answer it. But if you think about your 20 largest customers, and there's no need to name names, how would you split them in terms of those who are speaking the same language as you and looking to apply the same sort of thinking, not just in a few token projects, but progressively across the full scale of what they're buying? And let's call those as the high velocity, high momentum customers versus, let's say, those who are medium velocity or medium momentum. And those ones are maybe looking to experiment, play around, run a few projects. You're probably in the lead there. They're following your advice, but they're not really toe to toe. And then let's say low momentum, low velocity, where they're not really engaging with you and they're kind of kicking the can down the road. If you had to think about your top 20 accounts, like roughly, how would you split them in these three categories?
That's a great way of setting up the scene. We work with 3 million farmers, about 3 million farmers, 50 countries, thousands of suppliers. And from those 20 accounts that you just mentioned, I would say from the experience that we have, at least half of those are mature enough. Mature enough meaning they have committed to SBTi. Mature enough being that they have at least 1 to 3 LCA or sustainability managers or modelers that understand GHG reductions. Mature enough to say that they have a carbon accounting team that understand the difference between insetting and offsetting, and that primary data might not be always the right choice depending on what you want to claim, as we mentioned before. So from those 20 accounts, in terms of revenue, I'm ranking them in my head in terms of revenue and the segmentation of maturity. Then you have the remaining 10, which are, as you said, rolling with the flow based on what happened with the GHG protocol, based on what happened with SBTi, based on what other peers are doing. Now, I just want to make clear that we as OFI haven't yet put our targets out there on SBTi because we're working with some consultants to get the right targets per business unit. But we are a crucial part of everyone else's targets because, as we said in the beginning, we do have the team on the ground. We can monitor how are we going to implement or how are we going to reach to the targets that we have and that our customers have. And it's crucial to work together. So then I will put in the second level in maturity, as I said, the companies that are rolling or just flowing with the regulations And then we have a third segment, last segment, we just expect to have low carbon footprints, no deforestation risk, and low emissions from fertilizer projects, no waste, green packaging at the end of this segment, but are not willing to engage or are not willing to participate in a partnership, and they're expecting to get it as a tender or as an additional feature on the quality parameters to sell to them.
Yeah, I think that your split probably mirrors what I would expect as well, Pedro. I will not ask you to name any of the brands that you think fall into the third bucket, or the second. But is there any one brand that you look at, any one customer that you're impressed by, and that you think is actually doing a really good job in terms of how they think about this problem and how they're partnering? Like any one that you want to call out? And obviously, tell me if you'd prefer not to answer this, or you can go with sector, for instance, like any one sector that you think is exciting.
So let's start. So on your last question, we have three main customers that I cannot name. We have great projects together. We are implementing everything from the ground as a partnership. We have sessions per week where we sit and discuss what are the levers that have the best impact depending on our region. So if we think about the confectionery side, we work very close in thinking where are all the materials that we source from them and to them. And we design, even with the local teams that they have, we sit together and plan ahead. How are we going to supply this product from Indonesia? Does it make it easier logistically to move it from Indonesia to the factory? And which product can we produce to have lower emissions? And the same case in West Africa with another confectionery customer. How do we set up the best carbon removal project, the best insetting project, at what scale? And doing these kind of processes with them together, it creates a partnership, right? It creates a skin on the game. It gets the two teams working closely in every single aspect of the project, in the KPI development, in the budgeting, in the thresholds and the risks. And I think that is the only successful way that you have to reach to any of these targets that we have as companies.
Thanks, Pedro. And then final question from me. If you were to give one piece of advice to a sustainability professional in, let's say, a large food business or a food and beverage business who is trying to drive change in the value chain, and they're trying to set up projects, and they're, let's say, basically going on the same journey as you, what would that top piece of advice be?
I think the most important aspect that I've noticed in the last years by trying to set up the projects is that we need to have partnerships and we need to work in a collaborative way. It is really not a USP to be able to claim an insetting project. I mean, we all have to do it. We're all going to the same 1.5 degree. And I understand that for us, for example, the farm link and having the project on the ground is a huge USP. But the disadvantage is that companies or customers will just come asking for, as I said, for a tender on a quality basis, or I just want to buy low carbon. And we need to understand the reality on the ground. There is not enough cocoa. You see the prices right now. There is not enough cocoa coming. The climate crisis is affecting West Africa, virus, droughts, and many more. So my piece of advice for companies, for customers that will listen is we need to work collaboratively. We need to sit on the table and plan ahead. We cannot just expect suppliers to come with a solution. We need to sit and plan what is the risk for each company and how are we going to move forward together on this.
Thank you so much, Pedro. There's been a wealth of information that you've shared in the span of a very short amount of time. I'm going to try and summarize it in a few sentences and tell me if I've got it right. I think that, my main takeaways here are when you think about, let's say, supply chain reductions, you think in terms of projects, but you also want those projects to be linked to material output. And you want to be able to quantify and evaluate those projects in terms of the units of cocoa, the units of coffee, et cetera, that are coming out of them. You at the same time want to bring in co-investors from your customer base to support you and collaborate with you on those projects and making them work. The investment in the short term may be very project linked. Progressively, we think this is going to be more linked towards the material that's being purchased. When you think about your customer base, there are some customers and companies that really understand this and get this and work collaboratively with suppliers like OFI in driving change, running pilot projects, looking to scale these up across a larger share of the value chain. There are many others that are still learning and on the journey. And there are others still who are looking for the output and looking for the job to be done by someone, but not really getting into the weeds and into the kitchen of how things are prepared. This whole journey that we're talking about is not really going to be anyone's USP. There will be USPs that different partners can bring to the table, but actually driving reductions at scale, running projects at scale across large global value chains are something basically every big company is going to have to do. And they're going to have to bring many other players into the tent to help them with this. We touched a little on the landscape of solution partners, and I think very much in the spirit of collaboration, I think we both landed on a conclusion that there's actually room for many different types of players, and actually those players are going to need to be interoperable or modular and actually bolt on. You're going to need carbon accounting solutions, product labeling solutions, insetting, supply chain management solutions, and project management solutions, traceability solutions, all working in harmony. The data topic of primary data versus secondary data is a hairy one. I know you and I have both probably been in many conversations with stakeholders on this. And I think we both were aligned, which is nice, that you need both. You need good primary data where something differentiating is happening, where there's a supplier going above and beyond, where there's a project running to improve the quality, the sustainability credentials of the product. There you need primary data to demonstrate what's different. You also need primary data to train secondary data. And ultimately, many use cases will be pretty well served by secondary data. And so the data ecosystem needs to include both. Pedro, have I done a decent job of summarizing some of the main insights you've shared?
Yeah, I think that's on the spot. Very happy that things were clear. And I think the only point that I would like to add is the only point that I would like to add on the primary data, as you said, it's crucial to train models. And to train models, I think that's the advantage that we have as OFI, that we have primary data that will allow us to build AI, that will allow us to build secondary data at global scale. And of course, you need primary data from the farm or the farmer group to do that. And that's why the set of tools that we have will allow us to build this.
Fantastic. Pedro, thank you so much for that clarification. And thank you so much for joining us. We've really enjoyed having you on the show. I'm sure we'll be calling you back at some point in the coming months if you'll have us and if you'll be up for joining, because I felt like we could have carried on and covered a whole range of other topics as well. Thank you, everyone else, for listening as well. Please subscribe to stay updated on future podcast releases. If you enjoyed this, there'll be much more of the same. Thank you so much.